Hi guys, and welcome back to the Bronte Book Club. As with all my Bronte Book Club videos, today's video is sponsored by the Bronte Society as part of my role as the Bronte Society Young Ambassador, and this year I'm running the Bronte Book Club. You can see all of this year's videos in a playlist which I'll link in the description and up here, and there's also a Goodreads group where you can discuss the books that we are reading. If you haven't read Agnes Grey yet, or you haven't read Wuthering Heights, or you know that's a book you're going to miss throughout the year, then don't worry, because the Goodreads group and all the videos will stay up, so there is no rush. But if you do want to join in on the next book club read, then I'll leave all the links to that in the description and talk about it at the end of this video. So our March and April read was Agnes Grey by Anne Bronte, which I would consider one of the lesser known Bronte works. It was actually the first Bronte book that I ever read, so it holds a very special place in my heart, and I think it's one of the nicer ones. It's not as dark, it's not as demanding as, say, Wuthering Heights or even Jane Eyre, and I think it's such a lovely book, so I'm really looking forward to discussing it with you today. I think the best place to start with discussing Agnes Grey is right at the start of the book, and I love the first line, which is, "All true histories contain instruction, though in some the treasure may be hard to find, and when found so trivial in quantity that the dry shrivelled kernel scarcely compensates for the trouble of cracking the nut." And I think that that sums up the book really well, because a lot of Agnes Grey maybe feels like Agnes is trying to teach you a lesson or is trying to make you think morally about certain issues. She's a very religious character, she relies on her morals and thinks very carefully about the people she meets and almost judges them when she meets them. And I really love this about her. I love how she really does stick to her morals and lets her morals guide her. And I also think that this brings up the fact that she describes it as a true history. And out of all of the Bronte books, I feel like Agnes Grey may be the one that we most think about as an autobiography, or a semi-autobiography anyway, and I think that's a really interesting thing to consider. So Anne herself was a governess, just like Agnes is in the book. And the role of a governess is one that comes up quite often in Victorian fiction, because it is a role that women can have. It's a job that they are able to do. They are able to go out and earn money, but at the same time they're not involving themselves in business. It is a respectable job for women who need to work to have. Agnes at the start of the book really considers this, and she has to go and earn money for her family because they are struggling and they're at hard times. But at the same time, Agnes is young enough that she doesn't have to yet think about marriage, although that is something that her sister does during the novel. So the decision Agnes makes to become a governess is a really interesting one when we think about Anne. And as you go through the book as well, there are other decisions that Agnes makes and her mother makes that really do parallel the Brontes' lives, such as the school at the end of the book. This is something that the Brontes actually wanted to set up themselves. They had leaflets made and they really wanted to educate young people, but in the end that is a scheme that did not pay off. They didn't have enough people who wanted to attend their school, but it was something that was very alive in their imaginations, and I feel like Anne in some ways is making her dreams come true in the form of Agnes Grey. Another autobiographical element that I think is really interesting to consider, and something I'll talk about a bit more as the video progresses, is the character of Mr. Weston. Now I think that he is the best Bronte male character out of all the books, and I think that's very obvious why when you see characters like Heathcliff and Mr. Rochester, who are deplorable. So Mr. Weston is really sweet. He, just like Agnes, is very moral. He is a curate and he does the right thing all the time. He's very heroic, and this is something I could talk about all day because there are so many instances where he does the right thing, whereas other people definitely do the wrong thing, and these distinctions are something that Anne makes very clear. So when I think about Mr. Weston, I think about a man called William Waitman, who was assistant curate at St Michael's and All Angels Church in Haworth in 1839, and it is rumoured that him and Anne had a bit of a fancy for each other, and there's no evidence for this apart from a letter that Charlotte sent to her best friend Ellen, which said, "He, being William Waitman, sits opposite Anne at church, sighing softly and looking out of the corners of his eyes to win her attention, and Anne is so quiet, her look so downcast. they are a picture. So is Mr. Weston William Wakeman in disguise? I'm not sure if we'll ever know, and I do think it's a little bit dangerous to read books autobiographically, but I also think it's something to consider because as a writer myself, I draw on life experiences, and whilst I don't think we can say that the Brontes write about love because they know love or they've had love relationships, I also think that they were influenced, say, from the books that they'd read and stories that they'd heard elsewhere that they weren't involved with. But I also think it's a really nice story and something really nice to consider, and I really love William Wakeman as a person. I love hearing about him and stories of him. He was quite a cheeky fellow. He wrote them Valentine's cards, which was the first Valentine's cards they'd ever gotten, but he was also very valiant and went out into the community and looked after the sick, and that's how he eventually died. He caught an illness and died at a very young age, which was very sad. So Agnes Grey may be semi-autobiographical, it may not be, we won't ever know, but I also think it's something really nice to think about. I always like to think about Agnes Grey as it was first published in a 3-volume set with Wuthering Heights. So Wuthering Heights was the first and second book in the set, and then Agnes Grey was the third one. And imagine reading Wuthering Heights with how gloomy and sad that is, and then reading Agnes Grey, which in comparison is very light-hearted. But there are also moments during Agnes Grey where we see a darker side to the characters, and this is something I really like to think about. Animal cruelty, which Anne seems very keen to discuss in the book. There are numerous instances of animal cruelty in the book, such as the young Bloomfield child who likes to steal nests, and also the rat catcher who doesn't look after his dogs well, and the cat which goes missing and then Mr. Weston then finds. And I like how animal cruelty and the way that people treat animals is really a way of Agnes, and through Agnes, Anne commenting on the morals that people should have. So one instance of this I find really interesting is when Master Bloomfield finds a nest of chicks and says that he's going to torture them, and Agnes can't stand this, and so she gets a rock and crushes the chicks with it. And although that may seem like something that is very immoral, because is there a difference between torturing them and putting them out of their misery? I don't know in my mind which one is better, although arguably torturing something is worse than putting it out of its misery, but at the end of the day the chicks are still dying. But the way that Anne comments on this and the way that Agnes acts is as if she is acting in this very moral way because she is doing the right thing. And I definitely feel that the narration makes it seem like Agnes is doing the noble thing by killing the chicks and making sure that Master Bloomfield does not get his hands on them. And I don't really know how I feel about that as a reader. I think it's almost hard to read, but I think that does go back to the fact that this thing is common at this time, and so for a modern reader it can be quite difficult to read. But I do think that there is a darker side to Agnes Grey which maybe gets overlooked, and I definitely feel that animal cruelty is one of the defining ways that Agnes and Anne talk about how moral somebody is. Another major theme in the book, and the one that I definitely think people find surprising, is religion, because the way that Emily looks at religion in Wuthering Heights, for example, is in this very pagan, almost anti-Christian stance, although there are definitely Christian influences in there. But Anne is very pious and Agnes is very dedicated to her religion. She is so moral, as I've said already in this video. She strongly believes what she believes, and I feel like the book almost uses her as a lens to focus in on what people should care about and how they should act, and it is a very morally conscious novel which is very different to the others. And yet at the same time, with the animal cruelty and with the behaviour of the children and the Murrays, there is something very shocking about Agnes Grey, and something that doesn't quite sit well with you, not because you don't like the book, but because the actions of the characters in relation to the actions of Agnes are so very different. It's as if Agnes is this very religious figure and the others just aren't, and you're working out who is best, who is living in their best way, and ultimately that person is Agnes. And so I feel like the whole point of the book maybe is to teach people how they should be acting. It is that way of getting that kernel of truth out of the book, that kernel of truth that tells you how you should act and how you should be and how you should treat other people. I actually really like the religious aspects of Agnes Grey, and I love how dedicated Agnes is, which is something that I don't often read about, and I really got that sense that Agnes loves her faith. She loves going to church, she's been brought up with it, she enjoys hearing about religion and going to study her Bible and looking at the different aspects of what it means to be religious. And I definitely feel that in the other Bronte books you don't get that as much, which is surprising seeing as though Patrick Bronte was a religious man. He was the curate at Haworth, and that would have had an effect on the Bronte children because as well their Aunt Branwell was religious, and maybe that's because Anne was the younger child and so she was brought up with that more so than the others who had lost their mother, whereas Anne never really knew her mother, so Aunt Branwell was more influential on her. I'm not really sure, but I really love how honest Agnes is in the novel and how that means that Anne is being honest too. Agnes Grey is a really difficult book to discuss because I don't feel like enough people discuss it, so I can't draw on lots of different influences. But at the same time, I'm really excited to read Jane Eyre next month, because if you've read Agnes Grey, Jane Eyre is also about a governess, and so I'm interested to link the two together and see how they differ, particularly when talking about being a governess and also talking about love and romance. So in May and June we are going to be reading Jane Eyre. All the links are in the description to where you can join in on Goodreads and where you can find out more about how to join in with the book club. The Agnes Grey discussion pages are still open on Goodreads, so I'd really love to know your thoughts, or I will be answering comments in the description. I'd really love to know what you think about Agnes Grey if you've read it. Are there any surprising things about it that you didn't expect? I'd really love to know your thoughts. So thank you so much for watching this video, and I will see you guys soon. Happy reading!